I'd like to, at the same time, thank our panel and introduce Carl Craver, who's going to give us some concluding remarks to the symposium. Carl is a professor of philosophy here in the Psychology, Neuroscience, Philosophy, Neuroscience, Psychology program, and he's going to finish off our symposium for us. Thank you, Carl.
And I promise that this will be quick. Thank you. No, I think I'll be all right. I promise that this will be quick. Jeff asked me if I would just say a few concluding remarks and summarize what had happened today. But I had to write these remarks before I actually heard the presentation. But it turns out that it works pretty well, what I plan to say. I want to make exactly one point and express one hope. And that's it. But it'll take about maybe 5 minutes. All right? And the one point is this, that this dementia issue that we're talking about is a multi-level problem. That's the point. Before I met Richard, before Richard took me down to meet Beck and her mom
and Willie,
I would have said something similar. I would have said, this is a multi-dimensional problem. But here's the way I would have talked to you about this multi-dimensional problem. I would have said, well, we have people with various kinds of cognitive deficits and difficulty coping in their lives. And in fact, we can probe somewhat deeper. And we can say, oh, wow, this is not just a problem for people and their behaviors. It's a problem for their brain networks. It's a problem for their gray matter. It's a problem for the systems inside their skull. And in fact, we could go a little bit deeper into that. And we could say it's a cellular problem. It's a problem that, in the case of Lewy body dementia, involves these things called Lewy body, or plaques and tangles, are the sort of things that we talked about in Alzheimer's disease. In fact, my first neuroscientific research project was working on plaques and tangles in the hippocampus of people who had recently died with Alzheimer's disease. And we could, in fact, even characterize Alzheimer's disease or Lewy body dementia as a disease at the cellular level, or perhaps as a disease at the system level of the brain. And if we wanted to, we could even go somewhat deeper, and we could start targeting these particular molecules that we think are involved in the formation of these Lewy bodies or in the formations of plaques and tangles. But after I started talking to Richard, and so we could form a multi-level picture that looks something like this, where you've got whole people, and then you've got their parts, their brain regions, and how they interact with one another. And then you have the parts of those. You've got the cells and how they interact with one another. And you've got the molecules and how they interact with one another. And I'm a huge enthusiast for the kind of work that's being done of this sort. Getting at the molecular structures that are involved are clearly going to be part of understanding how we can treat and cure this disease. And similarly, for the cellular level changes, and for the brain system level changes, and the behavioral level changes that we observe in the individual cognitively impaired subject in these cases. But after spending some time with Richard and thinking about this issue over the last year, and as we've started thinking about who we would put into this panel, I now have a slightly different view about this hierarchy. And it starts something like this. We begin with an individual who has a whole set of cognitive difficulties. They're having difficulty remembering, difficulty using language, difficulty organizing their affairs and getting their lives together. And as a result of this, they have difficulty forming bonds with other people. It becomes much more difficult for them to relate to their children or to relate to their spouses, to relate to their parents, maybe even to recognize them as the people that they knew them as. And because of that damage to those sets of bonds, there are influences on entire families who are affected, enlisted in the care for these people, who suffer damage to their own emotional lives and their own personal experiences. And I want to stop at this point and say, just as we might talk about Alzheimer's disease as a disease of brain networks, we might also describe Alzheimer's disease as a disease of social networks, a disease of families. Something that has, as a crucial piece of its devastating effects, consequences above the level of the single individual. And of course, we could keep going. Whoops, that was supposed to go the other way. We could keep going up and recognize that there are caretakers that are also enlisted in this situation, and there are governmental agencies that are enlisted in this situation, and they're all affected by this sort of thing. So we might, in a way, start seeing this as a bit of a social problem, and we might even begin to think of it as a global problem that we're facing in general. Now, I mention this because now this is the way that I would think about this hierarchy. And I put the individual in the middle of that hierarchy and recognize that all of this is very, very important. But I think a lot of what we've been discussing today has really been focused up above the level of the individual. And we've used these terms like scaffolding autonomy. How do you build structures around the person to allow them to make use of the capacities that remain, to live their lives for themselves in the way that they want to the extent that it's still possible with the cognitive skills that they have, despite the ravages of this disorder. We've talked about ways of preserving dignity by engaging them in tasks, making them feel good about themselves, allowing them to dress properly, even in the small ways that we can in nursing homes, finding ways to preserve the dignity in these people. And we've also emphasized, I think, and Peggy Suavo's talk in particular was really great on this, I thought, finding pathways of caring, new pathways to access the people that are now before us and that have been transformed before our eyes into something very different from what we knew before, but trying to find new ways to move that person and engage that person and to maintain those social bonds despite the fact that memory is no longer in place, language is no longer in place. So let me just make this point in one other way to try to bring it home. This is a graph from 2005, published in The Lancet, a world study of dementia. The difference between the reds and the blues don't matter. It's the absolute height of the things that matter. As of 2001, about 25,000 people worldwide with dementia. By 2020, this Lancet article, published in 2005, predicts that we'll be around 40 million people worldwide. And by 2040, you can see that that's going to go up to around 80 million people worldwide as this baby boom moves in. At this point, over the age of 65, the statistics that I read online, 25% chance of getting dementia of some sort. And that chance, that probability just goes up as time goes on. So the point that I'm making with this graph is just, we got a problem coming. And we've yet to even see the beginning of this. This problem is just beginning. That's the point that I want to make with that graph. And what are we going to do about that problem? Well, here are 4 things that come to mind. We could try to prevent the disease, and that's going to involve discovering what causes the disease and trying to block those causes or to remove those causes from the environment. We could think in a curative way about designing drugs or therapies that will prevent the effects, the deteriorating effects on people's brains, on the molecules, on the cells that make up the brain. We can think in a restorative way. Maybe try to get the brain to grow new cells or incorporate new cells into itself or make new proteins that will do new things in the brain. And I think a lot of what's going on in contemporary neuroscience like that is extremely exciting. Some of the most exciting stuff that I see going on in neuroscience deals with that kind of change. Now these things I think are exciting, and as Dr. Morris indicated, prevention, cure, and restoration are things that everyone is working very hard on. And I know the people who work on this stuff, I know many people who work on this kind of stuff, and they are as earnest and serious about searching for these preventions, cures, and restorative treatments as you could possibly imagine. But the question remains, by 2040, how many of these dementia cases will in fact be cured? And how many of the dementia cases will still be waiting for that moment, for that discovery that will unlock the disease for us? And given that I think it's very unlikely that all of the forms of dementia that we've talked about here, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, dementia caused by stroke, Alzheimer's disease, given that I think it's somewhat unlikely that by 2040 all of those will become a thing of the past, we're going to be left with a population of people that are going to be living with a disease. And then the only thing that's left to us is to start thinking about coping. How do we minimize the suffering in the people who have these disorders? How do we scaffold their autonomy? How do we salvage what dignity we can? And how do we form social bonds with them, despite the fact that they're no longer like the people we used to know? And so for this reason, these questions that I've been asking about the proportion of funding that goes in different directions, I think it's wise thinking about the future to plan for a bad case, to plan for the fact that dementia is going to be with us for some time, and to think that part of our goal is not merely to eliminate the disease, which is certainly a wonderful goal, but it's also to think about how to cope with the people who have it and how to improve the quality of the lives that they have while they're living with the disorder. So the reason we organized this symposium, the reason why Richard contacted me and said we've got to talk about this, the reason why we thought that it required multiple different disciplinary perspectives of the sort that the PNP program tends to bring together, was precisely because we wanted to focus on that question. How do we get people to cope with disease, and how do we preserve humanity, how do we preserve dignity in the face of dementia? So I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank our speakers for coming to talk. I especially want to thank Jeff Dower for working over the last year to put this together. Richard Rubin for contacting me and insisting that I take this issue very seriously and organize this session. I should thank Kimberly Mount, who's the administrative assistant for the PNP program and is an amazing administrator of things, as you might have observed. And I should also thank the PNP program for funding it, and thank you for coming. So, thank you.